All right, welcome back, guys. In this part, we're going to continue building out the news section, aka the floating panel. And more specifically, we're going to start talking about the news API. So, if we come to our FinHub API documentation here and start scrolling down, you'll see there are two relevant endpoints that we care about. The first one is market news, which is going to give us market related general news. And then right below that, we have an option for company news. So as you can imagine, we're going to implement both of these and make sure we can start to get some data back. So without further ado, let's jump into our API caller class and start implementing a function to do this for us. So here we are, API caller, and we want to basically create a function just like we did for search. And this one is going to be called news. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a parameter. So we're going to say news for type. And the first parameter it's going to take here is the type of news we care about. So from the news controller, we're going to grab the type that we created there. Keep in mind that was either top stories or a company. And we are going to give a completion handler here, very similar to what we did for our search API call. I'm going to make it an array of strings. For now, we'll change this to a actual model momentarily, and this returns void like so. All right, cool. So the first thing we want to actually do here is create a relevant URL. So if we come and take a look at this, the URL or the endpoint is simply news. So I can go ahead and create an endpoint called news, but that might be a little misleading because news is a general term. So maybe I'll go ahead and say top stories, and the raw value for it will be news, just like that. And then in the term of whether this takes in, a parameter or any other arguments as, query parameters to our URL, it does take a category with a value of general here that I've highlighted. So we are going to call this function now. So we'll go ahead and say let URL is going to be URL for top stories, and then query items here, there is going to be a category, and it's going to be general, just like that. And now that we've created it, we can simply call our request function. But before we do that, let's see the response that we're going to get back. So it looks like we're going to get an array or a dictionary that contains multiple of these objects here, which look to be a news story. So let's go ahead and create a model that's going to back this because we want to, use it for decodable purposes to create our model from the JSON. So I'm going to create a new file here, and I'm going to go ahead and call it a news story.swift file. And I'm simply going to call this model a news story, which will be codable. And once we've created this, I'm going to paste on in what I've copied from the response, and we're just going to clean this up to be the actual response. So once again, you can hold the option key, and once you get this little indicator, you can get multiple lines highlighted with multiple cursors, just like that. And let's go ahead and take care of these. So the category in this case, all of this stuff is going to be a string. So we'll go ahead and do that. That's a string. This one is also going to be a string for the headline. Related, it looks like, is a string. Source is a string. We care about that. Summary is also a string, so I'll go ahead and drop that there. And then finally, the URL in this case is also of type string. Now, the one that I obviously missed here, first of all, is images, or image, and this is a string as well. This is a URL to the image. But then there's date time. So you might be inclined to make this type a integer, when in fact it should be a time interval. So you guys will see why in a little bit. But basically this is the news story that we care about, the object. We'll jump back to our API caller. And here we can go ahead and request that particular API endpoint. So there is our URL, expecting an array of news stories, and the completion will be completion. Just make sure you go ahead and update this to be news story as well, so we don't have any type mismatch, aka no error there. And let's go ahead and simplify our code by just dropping that. I'm going to put that there, and we're going to line break some of this stuff so it's a little cleaner to read. We'll drop that to a new line as well, and this one as well. So cool, so now that we've got this API set up, let's jump into our app delegate where we had created that debug function, and let me try to call this API. So in debug here, we're going to say API caller, share, and news. We care about top stories, and here is our result, and we're simply going to print out said results, go ahead and build in run, and let's see if this does what we want it to. We expect to see a whole lot of output down here of our response. Let's see what we actually got. Yep, looks like we are looking pretty good. So here is a whole lot of news stories for us. We've got some images in here, some titles, this and that, looking pretty darn good. All right, so one other thing that we might want to do, and we might want to do this later on, is right now in our model for our news story, we hold a date time as a time interval. More realistically, what's helpful is for us to have a date object and to convert that date to a string. We're going to want to do that business logic in the view model because we're not going to show a time interval on our UI because that would just be dumb. We want to actually show a nice formatted date. But before I get ahead of myself, let's go ahead and deal with the other variant of our API caller here. So we actually need a switch on the type. So I'm going to go ahead and say switch on the type, and in the top stories case, this is what we care about. But in the other case, which is, what did we call it? I think we called it company, we get a symbol back. So we do want to do something similar in here, but it'll slightly vary because we want to call a different API endpoint. So the other endpoint we want to call, once again, is right below it. It's called company news, and the endpoint is company-news. And it takes a query item of symbol, basically how you would expect. We have a from and a to where we need to specify dates. So let's go ahead and build this one out. So first of all, the endpoint that we care about, we're going to say this is going to be company news. So we want to try to spell things correctly here. We'll say company news. So this one right there. The next thing we want to do is specify the symbol as well as the from and to arguments. So let me go ahead and line break this a little bit more. This is going to be company news. We're going to line break this one as well, this one as well. First up, we're going to have a symbol. We're going to pass in the symbol. And now we have a from, which is going to be a string that represents a date, and a to. Now we don't want to hard code this. We want to calculate this based on the current time of day, or the current date, I should say. But there's a couple of things to note here. So there's a symbol, a from, right, which is in this format, the year, month, and day, and then to. So what we might want to do is maybe show the news from the last 30 days. That sounds reasonable to me. So how do we actually do this? Well, we can do all this code inline, but I'm going to create some extensions because this will greatly simplify the code that we have to write. And we're going to use a bunch of extensions on date formatters, and that'll help us also when we get to our view models to render out dates. So date formatter, we're going to have an extension on date formatter, and there is going to be a, let's call it a news formatter, or we'll say news date formatter, which is of type date formatter. And in here, we're basically just going to create one of these. We'll say formatter is a date formatter, and make sure you use the proper, capitalization here since everything is named fairly similar. Formatter, and then the most important thing, the format style here is what we want to specify. So we'll say format style. Let's see if I can find it. It might be just called date format. There we are, date format. And this will be year, followed by the month, and then lowercase 2d's for the day. Otherwise, you'll get something different. So now that we've got this, what we actually want to do is we want to use this date formatter to get a string. So let's go back to our API caller. So the to, we're going to specify today's date. So I'm going to go ahead and say date formatter, news date formatter, and we want to get a string from a particular date, and this is going to return to us a string. So we'll say from date, which is today. So I'll go ahead and create this actually up here so it's a little cleaner. We'll say today. We'll say today is a date, and then maybe we'll say 1 month back is going to be today, and then adding a time interval. And we basically want to add negative 60 times 60, which is an hour, right, times 24, which is the amount of time in a day. So we can actually make this simpler. So we'll say 3600 times 24 times 30. And this will give us the number of seconds in 30 days, aka a month, just about. And we'll get this, this 1 month back date. And here we can say 1 month back, or we can actually copy this whole thing, this date formatter business. And we can simply pass in here 1 month back just like that. And this should be all that we need to do to get this working. So let me go ahead and jump into my app delegate, and I'm going to change this to be company news, and we're going to pass in a symbol, maybe Microsoft symbol. So we'll go ahead and give this a run, and I'm assuming the response will look similar to what the first endpoint looked like, because we didn't change that. So it looks like we are getting something back. You saw it flash there and then it disappeared. 30 days might be a little too much. Basically, we're printing out too much stuff into the console, so the console sometimes loses its mind. But what we can actually go ahead and do is we can print out news dot count, and basically this will give us how many news stories we are getting back. But before I actually go ahead and do this, let's reduce the time interval for which we are providing. Maybe we'll get news for the past 7 days instead of 30 days. So we'll go ahead and do that. And you can actually also toss this stuff in to be a constant, since we're doing these brittle calculations. And here you can see we got 256 news articles about Microsoft. So you could tone this down as much as you want. A little subjective. Let me go ahead and toss this into a constant, because this 24 times 3600 represents a single day. So I'm going to come up here and say static let a day in time is a time interval, and this is going to be 3600 seconds, which is an hour. 60 seconds times 60 minutes times 24. And then we can come back down here, and here we are going to say constants.day multiplied by 7, so a week basically. And that is basically the API calls for our news articles in a nutshell, both for top stories as well as for actual companies specifically. So you can pass in a symbol, in other words. And that's all I've got for you guys today. So in the next few parts, we're going to start to plumb the data into our UI. We're going to set up our custom cells and all that good stuff so we can actually see these actual news stories in our UI. So I'll catch you guys in the next video.